Welcome, everybody. I think, we see some participants coming in. Oh, that's good. Hello, welcome. Harold Massey. Hi, Harold. Mark and Chris. Bruce. Hi, Bruce. Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday. Happy December. We will give everybody a couple minutes to come on in here. Glad you're all with us today. We can see all of our participants trickling in. We were remarking a moment ago that it's been a while since we did this. So if you have any technical difficulties, please drop a line in the chat. Angela's on and can hopefully help troubleshoot, and hopefully she can help us troubleshoot if we have any technical difficulties, but I think we should be good. So we're delighted to have everybody. All right, should we get going?
Sure.
Okay, all right. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Since it's been a while since we've done one of these, I'm going to go ahead and give some just some housekeeping. I am going into the chat right now. We're going to turn that on for everybody. Please do chat away. That is going to be the primary way that you all can speak to each other. As I said, the one and only Angela Douglas is in there. She'll be able to answer any questions and make sure that we see any questions. If you do have a specific question that you'd like us to address, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom. We aren't really using the raise hand feature. So if you want to grab our attention, stick it into the Q&A or the chat. And of course, when I do enable the chat here in a moment, if you want to chat to everybody, be sure that that's selected rather than the host or the panelist, Angela. So we'll get that going. In the meantime, if you haven't joined us before, and I know that there are some new faces, I'm Megan Carter, and I am here with Mike Hendry of the Hendry Winery. And we're here to talk about blending wines.
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, and we're going to we'll talk a little about blends. We'll talk about the Hendry blend and sort of its history, and then we'll talk about the wine club shipment you've recently received and what's in there, and how that relates to our blends and a couple of vintages of that. But I wanted to, as we got to thinking about what to discuss in this session, I started wondering about why blends are even a topic, and it's interesting to me, and I think it's really a reflection of how wine has changed, or the way people talk about and sell wine has changed over the years. And I think historically, the vast majority of wines have been blends, and that's not even, hasn't been something worth talking about until recently.
Yeah, we definitely wanted, obviously the original impetus for this was the fact that many of you, if you're in the Friends of Hendry Wine Club, received a blending kit from us, but we thought that this would be a good opportunity to not really talk about the mechanics so much of blending, but blended wines and their history, and why they're important, and why we've decided to do one. So we kind of, I think, wanted to start with that context a little bit.
Right. And what is actually much more recent is varietal labeling than blends. And I dug deep into my collection of old wine books today, and I have two, and one of the most interesting things about this collection of books to me is how it shows how attitudes and ideas have changed. It's a very interesting sort of time capsule, and most of these books that I have, I've collected at garage sales in Browns Valley. So most of these books
here in Napa.
Yeah, I've acquired for 25 cents each, but I have two editions of this book
called Table Wines.
Right, and written by Maynard Amarine and M.A. Jocelyn. They were UC Davis and UC Berkeley professors. And the title of the book is Table Wines, the Technology, Their Production. And the first edition that I have is from 1951. And what it says in there is that varietal labeling is a new concept. Basically, the direct quote is, it says, varietal wines have found increasing acceptance and are a step in the right direction toward producing higher quality wines from California and getting recognition for them.
And we should probably say that this book and what they're talking about here are varietal wines here in California, not globally, right?
Although that becomes an issue because the United States is such an important wine market, many places that haven't traditionally labeled their wines varietally now do. But it says here, much of the ordinary wine in California is sold under generic names, the generic names Burgundy, Chablis, and California Claret, and Sauterne was another one that
Yeah.
was used a lot too.
Champagne. I don't know if anyone ever, like, we definitely had a couple jugs of Carlo Rossi, like Hardy Burgundy, I think it was called in college. We put away a few of those, you know, it was, I'm sure, not
Yeah.
Burgundy.
And so now we're very used to this idea that, you know, place names are sort of protected and respected in terms of where grapes come from. But for most of, and it's really only very recently that
Mhm.
that some of this has been settled, but these European place names have been used in American wine production for a long time. And it goes on to say in the 1951 edition of this book, at present, the non-varietal wines such as Claret, Burgundy, Chablis, and Sauterne are usually made from whatever grapes the winemaker has available. So, you know, it really, they were all blends. You didn't know what was in there, and they were sort of using place names just for the sake of their recognition and no real informational content.
Right.
So then the interesting thing to me, it goes on to the 1970 edition of the book, and you have to bear with me. And I need these now, so please keep comments on the chat to a minimum. It says here, so far as we can determine, there are no French laws dealing specifically with varietal labeling. The well-known French appellation of origin limits the production in a district to certain varieties, but then they go on to say that you can have a wine from Bordeaux labeled Cabernet Sauvignon without necessarily any Cabernet Sauvignon in it. And then it goes on a little further to say that, you know, we have seen, for example, a Spanish Zinfandel on the American market, although this variety is not grown in Spain. So I think it's funny that sort of the Europeans flipped this on their head, and if we were ignoring their laws about place names, they began ignoring our laws about varietal names.
Yeah.
And so things have clearly settled down and reached a more, I think, logical point. But the fact that we're having blends as a topic of discussion is a reflection of how the way we talk about wines has changed.
Yeah, and I think that there is also this idea, and I don't think it's true as much anymore, but because, you know, many of us here in California, at least over the last, you know, that last book was the 70s, so the last 50 years, you know, we are getting used to varietal labeling. So I think there was this idea sometimes about the blend being like, is that the leftovers? Like, what is that, you know? And, you know, not only, I think globally, historically, there are many examples of wonderful blends around the world. But even here in California, despite our varietal labeling, some of your favorite wines might be blends, you know, and so blending is not, you know, the red blend from Hendry that many of you are familiar with is a blend of 5 different grapes. We make it very clear what those grapes are. It is, we talk about it as this multi-grape blend, but sometimes, and I think this might be, you know, something to keep in mind for the folks who are going to be, you know, doing their own blending at home. It's about, you know, using some grapes to maybe enhance others. You know, you might have a Cabernet Sauvignon and it could be 15% Merlot or something like that, right? So, you know, there are blends, I think, even though we are getting used to blends, I think even varietal wines sometimes may be blends, and the drinker might not necessarily
and often are, right? So
exactly, yeah.
And at the time these books were written, what you had to do to qualify for varietal labeling was have 51% of that variety. So it had to be more than half of that grape to be labeled varietally. Today, that regulation is 25%.
Well, 75%.
75%,
Yeah.
right? 25% could be something
Could
else.
be something else, yeah.
But 25%, I mean, that can change a wine tremendously, right? So you know, if you put 25% Syrah in a Pinot Noir, it's a very different wine.
Yeah.
I mean, 25% Cabernet Franc might change a Cabernet Sauvignon less, but you know, in theory, this 25% could make a wine that's not really recognizable in terms of what we think as varietals. So
yeah, and I think we just wanted to sort of start with that context and make that point again, even though this is not, we're, you know, we're not going to be blending wines here tonight, you know, you can do that at home, is think about that, is sometimes it's not about necessarily, you know, bringing us of all of these grapes together in sort of an equal and even way. It could be you know, using one to enhance the qualities of another grape, and that in some cases is bottled as a varietal wine. So blends are kind of everywhere.
And I think when it comes to blending and why you blend,
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of different answers to that question, and they're based in the question that comes before, which is what are you trying to achieve with the wine that you're making? So if what you're trying to do is express what a particular vineyard site and grape did in a particular year, then blending is probably less important, and you have to embrace some of the variation that makes wine interesting. But if what you're trying to do is make a wine that's consistent from year to year, you may find yourself doing a lot more blending to maintain a similar wine style. Or if you think a wine has a particular deficiency, if it needs some help, you may be blending to the degree that you want to improve it. Or if you're just trying to make something delicious, right? And you have a different set of goals when you do that. But there are a lot of reasons why you would.
Yeah. And if you are making wine at home, if you're using the blending kit, or if you're a home winemaker, you probably are just optimizing for what is delicious for you. And that's completely fair. As always, with these Hendry tastings, we're going to get a little geeky, we wanted to sort of mention some of those other reasons, and some of them, again, can be very idealistic or romantic. You're trying to make the best wine you possibly can. Sometimes it's a matter of what happened in the vineyard that year, right?
Right. And you can count on us to make this confusing somehow, but I think one of the practical reasons that in the past wines even with this varietal, this sort of appellation of origin style of labeling, that was typically meant to represent a blend of grapes within a certain area. And when you're growing grapes, I mean, you have years where maybe grapes that went through bud break early are damaged by frost. And maybe in other years, grapes that ripen late are damaged by late rains or weather that really won't allow the grapes to ripen. So if within a certain area you have a range of varieties that maybe in some years do better than others, you have enough fruit to make wine with. And so you have a range of what you might get from year to year, but there are very practical reasons for not trying to do exactly the same thing every year. Right.
And I think Bordeaux, where, we've taken inspiration from for this particular blend, is a good example of that. They are on a delta, it's marshy, they get a lot of rain, a lot of, they can get, summer hail and weird weather. And so for them, and it's also a very diverse region, so they've got different grapes growing in different areas, and they were kind of hedging their bets historically. And of course now it's all been kind of codified into like what you can and can't grow. And that's something that's been passed on or sort of looked to in other regions like Napa. We're now looking to what they're doing over there, but sometimes the original origin was more pragmatic than necessarily idealistic. But it is, a combination of grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, that do play very nicely together. And it creates a sort of flavor profile that we've come to be familiar with and love. And so that was, in many ways, the inspiration for our blend. Right. Is that right? When did our Hendry blend come into existence? What was the motivation?
Well, I think an important step in 1994, George bought the property to the south of us, which was really kind of an extension of the alluvial bench that we're on. And everything there had to be replanted. It was essentially growing on AXR1 roots and had to be replanted.
Rootstock that phylloxera eventually worked its way around and ended up destroying a lot of those vines. So it had to be ripped out.
Right. And it was in the early 90s. So in particular, Malbec and Petit Verdot were hard to find here in the early 90s. I think I have somewhere in here, there were only 34 acres of Malbec in Napa in 1994 and 87 acres of Petit Verdot. Those have increased by a factor of 10 or 15 since then, but compared to, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, they're still relatively low. But in this replanting, and we had then, I do know that the Malbec we got initially were cuttings. We were selling fruit to Opus One at the time, and they had imported some Malbec, which was sort of new. I assume exotic, and George was interested in seeing what the Malbec would do here and the Petit Verdot. And so we started with small blocks of those. And one of the big frustrations with the Malbec initially, and really for the first 15 years of growing it, was that it varied incredibly in crop level. So some years we have a 3-acre block of Malbec, block 14. Some years we'd get a half a ton per acre, and some years we get 4 tons per acre. So when you have half a ton and a half of fruit or 12 tons of fruit, what you're starting with in winemaking is very different. So all of these grapes, the Petit Verdot, the Malbec, the Cabernet Franc, and Merlot, were things that were initially planted here to have as potential blending additions for Cabernet Sauvignon, and people were starting to do more of that at that time. And in the first few years, so in the late 90s and early 2000s, we did in fact have a little blending with our Cabernet. But George moved more toward wanting to bottle and bottling 100% Cabernet Sauvignon.
A true varietal bottling of Cabernet. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that left us with these other grapes to look at this kind of blend with. And I do, there's definitely a freedom in blending too. I mean, I remark sometimes that single varietal wines are a bit like cooking with only one ingredient, right? And we'll talk a little more about this later, but you can make a very interesting wine by combining the strengths or maybe smoothing over the deficiencies of wines when you blend them. And it was fun to have these grapes to work on that style of blend with.
Yeah. So our first red blend as such was in 2001, right?
Right.
We've got a 2001 here. I think maybe the one difference, if you're familiar with our current version, is the label. I don't know, it's a little hard to see, looks a little different. We don't have the red on there, and it's called red wine rather than.
And if you look carefully, you can see the cork floating in there from my disastrous opening.
I don't think they could have seen it.
But if I remember correctly, this particular version was 60% Malbec, which I don't think it's been 60% Malbec since, but it was driven in large part by one of these years where all of a sudden we had lots of Malbec.
Yeah.
And it still tastes great.
And Malbec is one. So of these 5 varieties, we've got the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. We obviously make a Cabernet Sauvignon every year, Malbec and Merlot pretty much every year, but Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc have kind of come and gone, right?
Yes, they have. And the first time that we made a varietal Petit Verdot was 2001. And so my experience with Petit Verdot here, that 2001 was still, it's one of my favorite wines we've ever made. But there are other years where the Petit Verdot we made by itself have been some of my least favorite wines we've ever made. And it can be very incredibly tannic and rough and difficult. So we've made them a few times and never in large quantities, but done different things with them.
Yeah.
But recently we were hearing more requests for, Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc. Merlot, we're not making a lot of that, but it's a famous grape for a good reason, and there's been more demand for Merlot lately as well.
Yeah.
We've also been selling some of these grapes, and interestingly, Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc on an average basis are some of the most expensive grapes in Napa too.
Because I think a lot of people want to make these blends and have a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon and a lot of Merlot. So they think, oh, I'll just get little bits of those other grapes and, voila.
Yeah.
But I think you make a good point with that, which is that there were some years, and I've heard you say that some of the single varietal Petit Verdots that we've made have been some of your all-time favorite wines, but also some of your absolute least favorite wines that we've made. And so it is, as you said, tannic. It can be a little rough in some years by itself. So I think that is, another point in terms of the blending is that, maybe by itself it's not great, but could you balance that out with something else?
Right.
All right. So I think that's a good segue into these different grape varieties and sort of what they bring to the wine.
She's pointing off the screen because we've got them all lined up over here.
We've got many reds. We've got all the component grapes. Hope you're all drinking something, kind of related. We've got the red in our glass here. But, again, if you've looked at our red blend over the last couple of years, and we are now in the habit of putting on the back of the label, precisely what the composition is, you've probably seen that it fluctuates a fair amount. So here we have the 18, 16, and 17. In 2016, we used 8% Cabernet Sauvignon. We used 23% in 2017, and it's leading the pack at 48% in 2018. So
yeah,
it varies a lot.
And that's a little, I think, so the first vintage we made was 2001. And for most of the years we've made it, more than 50% of that wine in combination has been Petit Verdot and Malbec. I always thought of that as sort of the base for the blend. And in terms of why you blend, that's still, for me, a great combination of those two wines together.
And what about it? Do you like those two together?
For the Malbec itself, so in this lineup of wines, I think it's the least tannic. And maybe it certainly has a different range. I think the fruit's a little more muted than some of the other things. I think the Petit Verdot has some kind of higher aromatic notes that are very interesting. So I think when you combine them, the Malbec can really soften the Petit Verdot and round off the rougher edges, and the Petit Verdot can bring range and complexity to the Malbec. And I really like that combination. But we've also one of the progressions in the vineyard and with the Malbec was to, after a variety of things that I tried that never really did consistently increase production, or at least stabilize production, we sort of gave up and tried a different clone. And that has now given us a consistent 3.5 or 4 tons per acre of fruit. And that's allowed us to consistently bottle a Malbec. And so a bunch of the Malbec that had been going into the blend has sort of gone that direction, and now we have more demand for the Petit Verdot fruit and the Cabernet Franc as well. So it's kind of shifted the starting point for the blends that we're making, and that's reflected in the. I mean, we'll go through this, but I think this version of the red blend, the 2017, I like it, but it's much more Cabernet Sauvignon like in personality than I think that wine's been before.
Interesting. All right, well, let's dive into these different varieties. Where should we start? Merlot?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I tasted through these earlier today, and I realized I'm fresh off Thanksgiving, but what I thought the Merlot kind of brought was this sort of bright, tart. I mean, I thought of cranberry sauce, right?
Yeah.
We had a cranberry sauce made with whole berries and some orange zest, and I like the Merlot had that bright, tart fruit with certainly not the most tannic, but nice firm tannins.
Yeah, I definitely think and that's sort of the reason I want to start with it is on the less tannic end of the spectrum, right? A little more fruit forward, perhaps. And I think that's often, when people talk about Bordeaux blends, Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon are sort of the predominant grapes of Bordeaux, and often constitute, large portions of those blends. So I think that's sort of where people's minds go. But I think, here it can, as we've said, it can, we can have a whole variety. We can put things together in a whole bunch of different ways, and it's not necessarily focused on one of those. But I think it's definitely something that people think of when they think of Bordeaux blends. And I think it brings that fruit, and the stereotype, of course, is that it brings the fruitiness to the cabs, like big, bold, tannic sort of structure, and that's what makes them this sort of match made in heaven.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that.
Yeah.
But I do, yeah. The history of Merlot here is interesting too, and I was going through some of the crop reports, and really between 1980 and almost 2000, in terms of. So in 1994, I was quoting acres of Petit Verdot and Malbec, but really the grape that was being planted, there was more Cabernet Sauvignon, but Merlot was growing very quickly. People were planting a lot of Merlot. And it it's really stabilized since then. There's almost the same amount of Merlot now that there was in 1994.
Whereas Cab has just kind of gone through the roof.
Cabernet Franc has almost doubled. Cabernet Sauvignon has gone up by a factor of 2.5, and the Petit Verdot and Malbec have gone up by a factor of 12 or 15, but they're still much smaller than the others. But yeah, Merlot is the famous grape for a good reason, and between 1980 and 1998, it was really on an average basis were exactly what Cabernet Sauvignon was. They traced the same line on the graph. It's only recently that, so yeah, I mean, and we were talking about this earlier, and I heard her use the word codify with the way things are done now. I feel like people are always talking about wine in this static sense, and you don't have to look at very much history to realize that it's always changing. So what people are growing, what they like, what they think of wines, what they think is appropriate, it's really dynamic. Even when you do try to place some boundaries on it, it's or trying to stop that. Language is the same way, right? If you think people think of language as something static often, but it's always changing, and wine is always changing.
And I think Bordeaux is actually a good example of that. They have the governing body in the Bordeaux AOC has in the last 4 or 5 years approved about 7 or 8 other grapes that you can grow now in that region, and they're trying to grapple with climate change and sort of extreme weather patterns, and they've picked some grapes that they think can weather that a little, no pun intended, weather that a little bit better. And so what's really interesting is there are grapes, and of course I can't now off the top of my head remember what those are, but some grapes that we just don't historically associate with Bordeaux, but it doesn't mean that it's not a Bordeaux necessarily, right? And so,
but there are also grapes,
fluid.
The grapes that were certainly pre-phylloxera. There were a lot of different grapes in Bordeaux as well. So it's not. It's not the same for long.
Moving on to Malbec. Speaking of a Bordeaux grape that people associate with other areas, so we talked a little bit about it. You love it for its sort of the fruit that it brings. So here, and the color of these wines is quite different and interesting. I think you can, for the most part, identify them all on the basis of color alone if you have them lined up. But the Malbec's definitely the darkest, but the lightest in terms of tannin. And I felt today like this, that it had some earthy tones, and the fruit was a very sort of dark plum and blackberry kind of thing. It's like real black fruit kind of. I think more than like bright red fruit. It's the plummy, it's the boysenberry kind of stuff.
So I mean, it definitely very, very distinct in these components. And then the Petit Verdot, to me, typically it did have, and so the way I sort of attempt to assess tannin, I think people do this different ways, but I take a mouthful of wine and I swirl it around, and then I kind of count the time that it takes my mouth to feel like it's returned to normal.
Instead of that.
So that what those tannins are doing is really stripping the saliva out of your mouth, and it's a very physical drying of your mouth, and it takes time for your mouth to return to normal. And generally, the more I'm sure there's a point of saturation, but generally the more tannin there is, the longer it takes. And the Petit Verdot in this lineup is the most tannic. And it had, also aromatically, it had some of these sort of chalky graphite things, but also there's some, like I associate a floral note with the Petit Verdot.
Floral,
and sometimes a little kind of cinnamon spice kind of a thing with it.
Now you're getting into Christmas. And then we've got Cab Franc.
And I want to go back to Christmas for a second, because when it comes to this red blend, and there's certainly times when it's my favorite wine in what we make. Megan has apparently heard this more than I have, but there are only 2 times when I've heard people use a holiday to describe a wine. And they've both been with the red blend. And I was tasting with a group one day, and somebody said, "This wine smells like Thanksgiving." And then I heard in another time, "This wine smells like Christmas." So I immediately thought, like, what does Christmas smell like? But we do, and Thanksgiving, but we think of, some of the spices and
they're having the same discussion at the Yankee Candle Company too right now. It's like, what does Christmas smell like? So they can bottle it and put it in a candle, but apparently we've done it with wine.
Yeah. I think you're more familiar with the Yankee Candle Company than I am, but
It's not my favorite place, but
okay, all right. So anyway, Petit Bordeaux, also very dark in color. I think the next darkest in color, a little redder in hue compared to the Malbec. The Malbec's very purple.
teeth staining purple.
Yeah. And then the Cabernet Franc, I mean, I think one of the reasons people like Cabernet Franc and one of the things that it's famous for is its sort of herbaceous qualities. And this has that, some a roasted red pepper kind of tone, and firm tannins that are, I think, classic Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, sometimes it can be a little, I don't know, some of those green notes that you sometimes get with this family of grapes, like the bell pepper, the jalapeno a little bit. Yeah, to me that always jumps out with this.
And I think, you know, Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon, both, they have some more of these. With Cabernet Sauvignon, sometimes I think of bay leaves, I think of minty things and chocolate and earthy things. I like I've said this a few times, I think, because I think Cabernet is a very expressive grape in terms of soil and site and yearly variation. And I think our Cabernet Sauvignon varies quite a bit from year to year. I like this version quite a bit.
It's the 2018.
2018, I like the structure and the personality.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's another thing we should have noted is that we're talking here about all 2018s, which if you've got the blending kit is what you're working with. Though we still have some 17 red and 17 cab sort of available as a current release is what we're drinking, but we put those as sort of pre-releases. So
yeah.
Yeah, all right. So mechanics of blending, how do we make our blend? And I can see one question here. You know, how do we decide the percentages of the grapes? What are we looking for every single year? So you brought up earlier the very good point that, you know, what's our objective? Like when you're making a blend. So what's our objective with making the red?
I know George and George makes this blend.
Right.
Yep. And I know he often talks about wanting to make, you know, sort of a wine that's recognizable in structure and personality as far as Bordeaux grapes go, but he would like it to be lighter than the Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah, not as tannic.
Right.
Yeah, not as
tannic
and not as full body.
I'm not sure we achieved that in this case. Like to a degree, I think we did. It's a little softer. It's a little fruitier, I would say, but still a very structured kind of wine.
Yeah.
But the other objectives, and it starts with what we have available in a certain year, because we're definitely not starting with all of the same ingredients. So we have to consider how much Merlot we'd like to make and bottle, how much Malbec we'd like to make and bottle, what sort of blend we like the most and how that affects those other decisions, and then you and how much fruit we've sold, and we have to work from there, that starting point.
And you, if you're doing this at home with either our kit or just, you know, wine, you know, if you're making wine at home, you may have the luxury of having sort of equal parts of everything, but you know, maybe you don't. Maybe you've managed you have source for, you know, some Zin and then source for some Syrah, but maybe not as much, or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, practically speaking, we have some very real parameters that we're working with every single year when it comes to the contracts of what other fruit we've sold, what's happened in the vineyard that year in terms of yield and everything. But once we sort of take all that into account, I think that for George, you know, what he's really optimizing and thinking about a lot, and what I've heard him talk about is the mouthfeel, you know, how it feels in the mouth. And so he's tasting through, and he's, you know, again, trying to make a wine that is not as tannic, a little lighter than the Cabernet. So he's really paying attention when he's tasting these wines individually to the tannin, you know, to the body, and then, you know, using them to kind of complement each other. And so
and looking for a finished product that's complete and balanced and
right.
You know, he also uses the word flow through the mouth, and the feeling the effect and the weight of the tannins from front to back.
Right. It's not like it doesn't punch you and then fall away kind of thing. It's consistent. But so yeah, how that plays out in terms of the numbers every year is going to be very different. And you may decide if you're doing this at home, and we said we'd offer a couple little tips and tricks. I think one of them is tasting through all of these individually, figuring out what you like about each, what you think is interesting about each, and deciding for yourself what you want to optimize, what you like. Maybe it is mouthfeel, but maybe you love like something super structured. Maybe you love tannins. You're planning on serving this with like a fatty rib roast at Christmas or something like that, and you want to just like the most aggressive wine you can come up with. That would be fine,
Yeah.
But for us, it kind of comes back to that I think.
But it should be fun,
smooth.
and I find myself thinking about creating something that's different and distinct, right? And that for me, so when I was playing around earlier today with these wines, I was looking at things that didn't have a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. I was looking at combinations of the other three as something a little more novel, which was sort of fun, fun for me to play with. So it goes back to, thinking about what you want to achieve when you start, and you go about it different ways.
Yeah. And in addition to these component wines here, as I said, we also have some of the 16, 17, and 18 red. And as a little spoiler for you, if you're in the Friends of Hendry Wine Club, your spring shipment, 2023 spring shipment, you'll receive a vertical. You'll receive one each, one or I think one. Angela can correct me if I'm wrong, but one each, at least of these three vintages. So you'll be able to compare. So, it could be kind of fun to see what you come up with and what your percentages are, and then what percentages, we've used in these blends. But of course, the vintage, varied, and we hope that, again, there's some consistency, but those 3 years are very different years.
Yeah. We never know what we're going to get these days.
Yeah.
And so, and recently, obviously we got some rain today, which is nice, but several of our recent vintages, including 2017, have sort of been, the harvests have kind of been defined by really serious heat waves that at a minimum, they really make some of your winemaking decisions early on. And in this comparison, I think 2016 and 2018 were more what I think is normal and relatively easy harvests. I think they're more classic for us in their style.
Yeah. And you made an interesting point when we were talking about this session yesterday, is that, that sometimes vintage, as you said, can make those winemaking decisions for you. But that could also maybe be one reason that you blend, right? You're trying to potentially make up for something elsewhere. With these grapes in particular, I'm thinking about 2017, and I remember that heat wave coming over Labor Day. We'd already started picking, if I recall, but probably hadn't picked any of these grapes, maybe with the exception of the Malbec.
I don't remember specifically. I do know that we had, the Malbec may have been picked, but it, like this year, and again on Labor Day weekend, basically almost all the board. In this time around, we'd picked the Merlot before it got really hot. We were picking the Malbec in some of the earliest of the hot days, but and we picked the Primitivo before it got hot, but most of the Zinfandel and the rest of the Bordeaux varieties were out through the heat. We were essentially picking as fast as we could, but it was not fast enough.
And I guess the reason I bring this up and I ask is that when we think back and say, 2017 was a really hot year, we had that heat wave, it might be that whatever wine you're drinking, maybe it was picked before that heat wave, right? So, we like to, I think about, and it sort of helps us remember, like, that year was the year of the crazy heat wave or something on Labor Day, but it may not have been defining for that particular wine or these particular grapes.
Right. And that also sort of goes back to why have a mix of grapes in a certain region or in a certain vineyard. And 2011 in many people's minds was a terrible vintage, but that was essentially related to a big early rainstorm that we got. So that the first rain came early, and it was 3 inches or something. And all the fruit that was out after that was changed a lot, but a lot of the fruit that was picked before it was completely unaffected by that big storm. And it's the same with the heat. A lot of, even if from now on, people are going to define a particular vintage by smoke or heat.
Right.
I mean, 2020 is another example. We picked a lot of fruit before the smoke reached us. So it's always, we tend to simplify by latching on to something specific about a vintage, but it certainly doesn't speak to all the grapes and wines.
Yeah, but yeah, something to consider as you start to taste through these different vintages in the coming months and comparing to yours is that, vintage is one component of why they're different, but there could be many others as well.
Right.
All right, I see we have another question here, from Bruce. All right, after you have your, after speaking of glasses, I'm gonna have to.
After you have your starting blend and have tasted that and noted the attributes, what are the factors you think about to decide what to add to move the blend closer to your target attributes? So, I mean,
You're assuming we don't hit it out of the park the first time, is that right? That would be correct. There's a lot of a lot of iterations.
Yeah, and it is an iterative process. If you may start with the point of view of saying, I'm looking at the Malbec and the Petit Verdot and the Merlot together. We would like to look at adding, and maybe it comes down to, barrels too, right? You're looking at if we're adding a certain fraction of Cabernet Sauvignon, how have we moved it in terms of structure? And this is one of the biggest tools that George has historically used in finalizing the blend, is looking at how much Cabernet Sauvignon to add back and how that shifts the structure. So you can add, a percentage, you can look at adding more, you can see if you want to move it back, but it is an iterative process in terms of honing in on the wine style that you like.
Right. Yeah. So again, having that original objective like front and center in your mind, so you know, like, gosh, this isn't as structured as I would like. What might I add in order to get there?
Or I would like it to be lighter and back off on the Cabernet and maybe the Petit Verdot a little bit too.
Yeah. One of my favorite things that George has said, when I see him, working on this wine in the lab is, talking about how sometimes there can be too much of a good thing, right? You think like, I want this wine to be a little more structured, so I'm going to add 5% Cabernet Sauvignon or Cabernet Franc, and you think, oh gosh, this is really good. Well, the 10% must be even better, and sometimes you can overshoot it a little bit. So I think working in sort of those small increments can be important.
And I was kind of flashing back to when we started this discussion, we were talking about why blend. And there are grapes like, we've talked about adding structure and tannin with Cabernet, but color is a thing that people do. And it's one of the reasons that people think about blending Petit Syrah into Zinfandel. They want to, adjust the color, and people, and wines like that get attention sometimes too. So there are reasons for it that, people are shifting what they've started with in a certain direction. But again, depends what you're trying to accomplish with the wine.
Yeah. All right, we've got a question about barrels, vanilla, chips, etc., that can alter the taste.
I would. So we certainly don't put flavor additives into wine.
Yeah.
And I mean, there probably are some people who do that, but there probably aren't very many, and certainly in sort of higher end wines. However, wood and oak brings a bunch of flavor components that include vanillins. I noticed the vanilla there. So it's George would give you a very different breakdown of this than I would. What I like to say about barrels is that they're a very important part of the winemaking process, but you would have a hard time finding a more expensive, less efficient way to do it. So I'm a vineyard guy for the most part. I deal with the farming here, and I would like to think it's sort of a traditional idea, but I would like to think that the vineyard and the farming is the most important part of what we do. And I feel like there are a lot of winemakers who know very little about the vineyards where their fruit comes from. And the first thing they talk about when they talk about their wines is the oak and the barrels they use. So I sort of made fun of this for a while. And as I was doing that, I realized that I should probably go educate myself about barrels a little more before I criticized what other people were doing. And I had attended a very interesting, to me, extremely interesting series of seminars on oak and wood chips and staves and additives and all of these things. And it's incredibly complicated. So that the basic, there are two basic wood components, lignin and cellulose, and they produce different kinds of aromatics, and that can depend on how the wood's aged and how it's toasted and how the barrel's constructed and surface area to volume and all of these things. And some of these barrels that are incredibly expensive, there's very little, there's a lot of tradition and often less science that goes into how they're made. And to me, very interestingly, some of the most precise and scientific people when it came to wood and wood additives were the chips people. And they could talk about how they would, if you wanted certain aroma profiles, we have these kinds of chips. And if you want different aroma profiles, we have those kinds of chips. And if you want to blend, we can do these things. So it's a really interesting topic. And, one of the speakers got up there, and this was a winery that they buy a lot of barrels. And what the guy said was, well, barrels are an important part of our wine style. These are all really smart and interesting people talking about what they do. And this guy said, we buy a lot of barrels and we spend a lot of time studying our barrels and we do a lot of experiments. And the thing that stands out more than anything else when it comes to oak influence is the toast. He said it trumps everything else, the forest, the type of oak, all these things. So, in this case, when we make the wines here, what really provides the oak aromatics are the new barrels, and different wines that we make, we use different fractions of new barrels for. So some of our wines will use essentially no new oak. Some will use a third, some half. The only wine that we regularly use 100% new oak for is the Cabernet Sauvignon, and the feeling is that that's also the only wine that balances
stand up to it,
that level of oak input. All of our barrels are, we've experimented with a couple of Russian and Hungarian barrels, but essentially all of our barrels are French oak barrels of one kind or another. They almost all have a medium or a medium plus toast. It turns out that those are not very precise definitions of anything either, but
varies by Cooper.
Medium plus is a little bit darker than medium, but it's not a very, so oak and oak influence, it's a huge topic in wine. It's a very important topic in wine. Certainly in our part of the world, if you're not using expensive barrels to make your wine, you're sort of viewed of as cutting corners or looked at as cutting corners. I suspect that if we bought more wine on the basis of blind tastings, that alternatives to oak barrels would be much more popular.
Yeah.
And wine would be less expensive.
And cheaper, yeah. And then I think there is an important question maybe embedded in there too, which is, and this gets to sort of the mechanics of how we do this, is that typically when we pick all of our fruit, usually by block, right? So all the Malbec will come in together, all the Merlot will come in together, et cetera. The Cabernet, we have so much of it that it's typically sort of subdivided, but we'll pick it all individually, ferment it, and then George will start the blending process, figuring out, well, it's probably about in January or so where he'll start figuring out how he wants to put things together, which I think is such an amazing skill to be able, those wines at that point don't taste particularly good.
And George has been spending a lot of time, and he talks about it, but blending different fractions from the press. So we're talking about blending, but there are blending steps that even happen before we have a single variety from a single block from so what you get at different stages of the pressing process of the whole clusters in white grapes and the pumice when the fermentation is finished in the red grapes is also part of the blending and how things are recombined.
Yeah, but we'll blend it, and then we will we make the final blend, then we'll put it back in barrel for a little bit for further sort of integration and aging.
I'm seeing some more oak
I
questions.
know we need to
tonight.
have a session on
Yeah,
barrels.
that would be fun.
And Karen, I saw your question. We'll get to your question in a moment about sort of earlier in the process about, vineyard decisions and everything like that can influence the blend. But just to sort of wrap up this discussion about barrels, Ken, I see your question about California oak. I don't think California oak is particularly common, but American oak, other species of American oak.
Yeah, so I think
are.
what I've been told, so in Missouri,
Yeah.
Tennessee, these places, so there's a species of oak there that they call a white oak, that are mostly used in the barrel making there. I've never seen a barrel made from California oak.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues here, many of the oak trees are not particularly straight the way they grow here. I don't know what the.
Yeah, but I think it's another area where, again, we like to romanticize things, or people talk about French oak versus American oak, is one better. They're just different species of oak tree, and they have therefore different properties and characteristics. And so, like, what do you like as a winemaker?
Right. And they do have different, so there are things that I've been told, and I haven't necessarily looked at this on my own and independently, but I've been told that American oaks tend to be higher in vanillin, so I haven't seen those measurements. I believe Russian and Hungarian barrels are essentially the same species of oak tree that a lot of the French ones are. But another one of the takeaways from this oak seminar I went to was the fact that variation within an oak tree, from top to bottom or inside to outside, can be at least as big as the difference we talk about from forest to forest, or even among different kinds of oak trees. So it's complicated. Yeah, very. Yeah, maybe this is a future virtual tasting seminar topic, because and there may just not be enough oak trees in California that are straight enough to make that a viable industry.
Yeah,
I don't know.
All right. So Karen, you had a great question. We were talking a lot here about the final steps, like, once of blending, once the fruit comes into the winery, but you're asking about, early decisions, things that are made out in the vineyard, like in the spring. And I think you're talking a little bit about pruning, does that impact, do we have the blend in mind when we're thinking about, that kind of thing? I would say with pruning, probably not.
No. So we do have very specific goals for what we would like individual blocks and individual varieties to do,
to yield,
like yield wise. I mean, one of the, and when it comes to vineyard decisions, and one of the most difficult things is you don't really know what the weather's going to be like next month. So sometimes you really benefit from making the right vineyard decision early. But if you think that decision is removing a lot of leaves, and then all of a sudden you have a horrendously hot August, then you create problems for yourself in different ways. So that's one of the, some of the viticulture decisions involve some guesswork weather-wise, but we have ideas for what we would like to get quantity-wise from these different vineyard blocks. Often we're lighter. In the last several years with the drought, we have less fruit than we would like. And in other cases, we're thinning fruit to get back to a certain crop level for quality reasons too. So yes, we're definitely thinking about how much fruit we're going to get. I don't think we're making blending decisions that way with the vineyard work. Yeah. And we have, we're in an unusual position perhaps compared to some other estate wineries where we have a lot of fruit and a lot of acreage. And, so generally, has there been a year where we've had like absolutely nothing of something? Or come close? Well, yeah, sure. Like 2008 was a year when we probably lost 2/3 of our Chardonnay. So it's not that we due to frost. Chardonnay and Albarino, we've experienced frost issues with that. I'm thinking with these in particular, but some of the years where we had a 0.5 ton per acre with the Malbec, it's so, it does happen. Yeah. But that's a great question. Another question here.
Sometimes there are very small percentages of a grape variety in a blend. Do some varieties like Petit Bordeaux have more effect than others?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a nonlinear chemistry that happens where a small change in the percentage of one varietal can make a big difference?
The answer is yes. And sometimes, and I hear, I've heard and seen and tasted, I mean, people talk about blending 0.5% of this or that, and it can be very tiny quantities. I sometimes wonder, even if in the moment that makes a substantial difference, I sometimes wonder how big that 0.5% difference will be in a year or so. I think some of these things, I hear people talk about things in winemaking that may or may not be upheld in a blind tasting. I mean, it happens a lot, but people do blend very tiny quantities of things. And there's no doubt that tiny quantities of some wines in another wine can have a really big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we're getting close to 6 o'clock and it looks like we've answered a lot of the questions. I thought it's become a bit of a tradition, maybe end on a food note, because that's always a question we get here at the winery, which is, what would we eat with this? And obviously it's the holiday season and we've been told these wines taste like Christmas and Thanksgiving, but do you have any favorite pairings with the red?
So I'm still stuck on Thanksgiving, and one of the things we made, so my father-in-law has an amazing wood-fired oven, and we cooked a prime rib in that was a little bit smoky, and it came out perfectly. And that, I mean, this is not super creative, but it's really good. These wines in this kind of structure does really well with that kind of meal.
Yeah, short ribs. I'm gonna make short ribs tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a great classic pairing for the red. But I think that is one of the reasons people think of it as this holiday wine. Is I know I at least gravitate towards it in the winter months where it's colder and darker earlier, and like you kind of want something cozy.
Yeah.
And I want cozy food like short ribs and a roast maybe.
Right. And I think the herbs, like we with this roast, we had a chimichurri that had a lot of oregano and these herby characteristics in some of these wines are really
but I think
nice with that.
And I think we talk a lot about meat sometimes with these big reds, but there are, I think, a lot of options if you don't eat meat, right? But those kind of notes that you're calling out, right? Like we've talked about these kind of rich, fatty meats, that richness, I think, is an important characteristic to try and kind of pair the herbaceousness, and you can imagine.
And I know everyone here has tasted with George and, looked at the effect of richness and fat of olive oil on how these tannins. So these tannic wines balance well with that kind of.
So I think you could easily come up with a vegetarian or vegan dish if you wanted that, used other sources for fat and richness, and you could create a good, I don't know, like a chili or a stew of some kind. I think could be really yummy.
Yeah.
So we'd love to hear what you guys are drinking with this. We of course also would love to hear what if you have a blending kit, and again, we know that not everyone does. We do have a few more if you're interested in getting one, but if you have one, we would dearly love to see pictures of what you come up with. We've seen a couple come in and it's been a lot of fun, so we really hope that you're enjoying this. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. We would love to answer them. And we hope that, as here at Hendry, we're all big wine geeks, and we hope that, we know that many of you are, and that you're having a good time with the kit and indulging that in yourself too. So
thanks for joining us, and happy holidays.
Yes, happy holidays. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.